Someone you know has not left their home in 3 days, maybe 5, maybe longer. Their curtains are drawn. Their phone buzzes with invitations they do not answer. The world outside is moving at its usual speed and they are simply not in it. And if you ask them how they are doing, they will probably say fine. They might even mean it. From the outside, this looks like a simple thing. Laziness, perhaps. Avoidance. A bad habit that got out of hand. And if you have ever found yourself on the inside of it, you know that the story the outside tells is almost entirely wrong. Because here is what I have come to understand. People who withdraw from the world and stop leaving their homes are not, in most cases, people who have given up. They are not people who are broken or weak or fundamentally deficient in some way. They are people whose internal world has become more compelling, more manageable, or more safe than the external one. And that shift from outside to inside is not random. It follows a very specific psychological pattern. And once you understand that pattern, the behavior stops looking like failure and starts looking like exactly what it is. A coping strategy that worked until it stopped working, and a person who deserves to be understood rather than judged. Today, I want to break down the psychology of people who stop leaving the house. The traits they share, the internal architecture that drives the behavior, and what it actually reveals about who these people are at their core. Let's start with something that might surprise you, because the first thing most people assume about someone who never leaves the house is that they are afraid of the world, that there is some obvious anxiety, some diagnosable phobia, some specific thing they are running from. Sometimes that is true, but more often, the psychology is more subtle than that. The most consistent trait I have observed in people who withdraw from the outside world is not fear. It is a very high sensitivity to the cost of external engagement combined with a very low sensitivity to the cost of withdrawal. Let me explain what I mean by that. Every time you leave your home and engage with the external world, there is a cost. Energy spent, unpredictability managed, social performance maintained, sensory input processed. For most people, this cost is moderate and is easily offset by the benefits: stimulation, connection, purpose, variety. The math works. They go out. For people with a highly sensitive nervous system, that cost is significantly higher. The same trip to the grocery store that registers as neutral for most people registers as a genuinely taxing experience for them. The background noise, the social navigation, the unpredictability of what might happen, the energy required to manage their own presentation, all of it is amplified. The math starts to not work. Staying in becomes the rational choice. And every time they stay in, the home becomes more associated with relief, with safety, with the absence of cost. And every time they go out, the contrast makes the outside world feel harder by comparison. Over time, the gap widens. The home becomes the only place where the nervous system fully relaxes. And the outside world begins to feel not just uncomfortable, but genuinely threatening in a way that is very hard to explain to people who do not experience it this way. This is the first hidden trait. These are people whose nervous systems charge a premium for external engagement, and nobody ever told them that was what was happening. Now I want to go deeper, because nervous system sensitivity is the soil, but what grows in that soil is shaped by something else entirely. The second hidden trait shared by people who stop leaving their homes is what psychologists call a high internal locus of experience. This is a pattern in which a person finds their richest, most meaningful experiences inside their own mind rather than in the external world. They think deeply. They feel deeply. They process experience at a level of detail and complexity that most of the external world simply cannot match. A conversation about something that truly matters to them can be more alive than a room full of people talking about things that do not. A book, a film, a piece of music, a sustained thought about something real. These experiences can be more nourishing, more genuinely satisfying than most social occasions. This is not depression. This is not apathy. This is a specific kind of richness that happens to live inward. The problem is that the world was not designed for people like this. The world rewards external engagement. It rewards presence, visibility, output, performance. It has very little patience for the person who is doing their most profound living inside themselves. And so people with a high internal locus of experience often grow up with the quiet suspicion that there is something wrong with the way they are wired, that their preference for depth over surface, for solitude over company, for inner life over outer activity is a deficiency rather than a design. And that suspicion over time can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have been told often enough, directly or indirectly, that the way you experience life is wrong, you begin to build your life around protecting the way you actually experience it, which often means pulling further inward, building a life that requires less defense of your nature, staying in the one place where the way you are wired is simply accepted, because the only person who has to accept it is you. Here is where it gets interesting, because the third hidden trait is one that almost nobody talks about, and it is, in my view, the most important one. People who stop leaving their homes often have an extraordinarily refined sense of personal integrity. They are, in a very specific sense, allergic to inauthenticity. What this looks like in practice is a person who finds most social environments quietly exhausting, not because of the people in them, but because of the performance required to exist in them. The small talk that says nothing, the social scripts that everyone follows without examining, the implicit requirement to be a presentable, agreeable, legible version of yourself, rather than the actual version. For many people, this performance cost is simply the tax you pay to be in the world, and it is worth paying. They compartmentalize. They perform when needed and are themselves elsewhere. They manage the gap between the public self and the private self without too much friction. But for the person with high integrity sensitivity, the gap itself is the problem. Every time they have to perform a version of themselves they do not fully inhabit, something in them registers it as a kind of violation. Not necessarily a dramatic one, but a quiet, cumulative one. Like a low-grade friction that never quite resolves. And the home, over time, becomes the only place where that friction disappears, where the self they actually are is the only self that needs to exist. Dr. Brené Brown's research on authenticity and shame is very clear on this point. People who experience what she calls high shame proneness, who are acutely sensitive to the gap between who they are and who they are supposed to be, often develop withdrawal behaviors not as a symptom of weakness, but as a protective strategy for the self. Staying in becomes a way of staying whole. That is not avoidance. That is self-preservation. Now, I want to talk about the identity layer, because this is where the psychology of staying home stops being about individual traits and starts being about the story a person tells about themselves. Behavioral psychology is very clear on this. We act in accordance with what we believe we are. And for people who have spent significant time withdrawn from the outside world, a very specific identity narrative often develops. Sometimes it is imposed from outside, sometimes it constructs itself from the inside. But it almost always sounds some version of the same thing. I am someone who cannot handle the outside world. I am someone who is choosing to be careful about where I spend my energy. Not I am someone who values depth and intentionality over obligation and performance. But I cannot handle it. I am not capable. Other people can do this, and I cannot. And that narrative, once it takes hold, is self-reinforcing in a way that has nothing to do with the actual evidence. Because every day that passes without going outside becomes evidence for the story. Every invitation declined becomes confirmation. Every avoided situation becomes proof. The trap is not the behavior. The trap is the story about the behavior. Because the behavior, taken alone, might simply be a person honoring their own nervous system and their own need for an inner life. But the story that calls it inability rather than choice turns what could be a preference into a prison. This is the identity distinction that I think is the most important thing I can offer you in this conversation. There is an enormous difference between choosing your environment because you know what you need and contracting into your environment because you have decided you are not capable of more. One is self-knowledge. The other is a story that has overstayed its welcome. Let me be completely honest about something that many people in this situation have never fully examined. A significant part of what keeps people inside is not the outside world at all. It is the version of themselves they are afraid of meeting out there. Here's what I mean. When you withdraw from the external world for an extended period, the world outside continues to move. People continue to grow and change and build things and have experiences. And at some point, the person inside begins to sense that a gap has opened between who they are now and who they imagined they would be by now, between their current life and the life that the outside world represents. And going outside at that point is not just going to the grocery store. It is a confrontation with that gap. It is stepping into a world that has kept moving while you stood still and having to reckon with what that means about you, about the time that passed, about the choices made and not made. That confrontation can feel enormous. And so the home becomes not just a refuge from the world's demands, but a refuge from the question of what your life means. You can stay inside and not have to answer it. You can stay inside and the question remains abstract, future tense, still technically possible. Going outside makes it present tense, and present tense is much harder to avoid. Psychologists call this identity foreclosure, the suspension of the process of building and testing an identity, often in the service of avoiding the anxiety that process generates. It is not giving up exactly. It is more like pressing pause indefinitely, and the longer the pause, the harder the resume button feels to press. Here's something I want to address directly because it is the question underneath everything I have said so far. Is staying inside always a problem that needs to be fixed? The honest answer is no, not always. Not automatically. There are people who live deeply interior lives, who work from home, who structure their existence around minimal external engagement, and who are genuinely well, genuinely creative, connected, purposeful, and alive. Their inner world is not a hiding place. It is a home. And there is nothing wrong with a person building a life that matches who they actually are rather than who the world expects them to be. The distinction is not how much time you spend outside. The distinction is whether the inside feels like freedom or like a trap. Freedom feels like choice. You stay home because you want to be there, because it is where your best life actually happens, because you have made a considered decision about how to spend your energy. And this is it. Trapped feels like the absence of choice. You stay home because you cannot imagine going out, because the thought of the outside world creates a dread you cannot fully explain, because you have quietly decided, without ever making the decision explicitly, that you are not the kind of person who does the outside world things anymore. One of those is a life. The other is the beginning of a slow contraction that, left alone, tends to continue. Here is the practical side of this conversation, because I want to give you something real, not just a framework. The first thing, if you recognize yourself in what I have described, the most important question you can ask is not what is wrong with me. It is what am I actually choosing here, and what has been choosing itself without my awareness. There is a meaningful difference between the things you have consciously decided about your life and the things that have simply accumulated through avoidance. Most people who have withdrawn significantly from the outside world have a mix of both. Some of it is genuine preference. Some of it is accumulated avoidance that never announced itself as a decision, but became one anyway. Getting honest about which is the beginning of having actual agency over your own life. The second thing, start small and start internal before external. The goal is not to force yourself outside through willpower. That almost never works and often makes things worse. The goal is to begin questioning the story, not the behavior, the story about the behavior. Are you staying inside because it is genuinely where you need to be right now? Or are you staying inside because somewhere along the way you decided you were not capable of more? If it is the second one, that is not a fact about you. That is a story. And stories can be rewritten, not all at once, not through a single dramatic act, but through small, repeated choices that accumulate into a different version of what is possible. The third thing, understand that the nervous system that finds the outside world expensive is not a defective nervous system. It is a sensitive one. And sensitivity understood and worked with rather than pathologized is one of the most valuable things a person can have. The goal is not to become someone who finds the outside world easy. The goal is to become someone who can navigate the outside world on your own terms, in amounts and in ways that match what you actually are, without losing the inner life that makes you who you are. That is a different goal than cure, and it is a much more honest one. I want to close with what I believe is the most important thing in everything we have discussed today. The people who have withdrawn most deeply from the outside world are very often the people who feel most intensely, who care most deeply, who are most aware of the gap between what life could be and what most social situations actually offer. They did not stop going outside because they stopped caring. They stopped going outside, in many cases, precisely because they care too much to keep pretending that the surface is enough. There is something almost paradoxical about it. The people who seem most disengaged from the world are sometimes the most sensitive to it. The people who seem most absent from life are sometimes the ones most aware of what a real life could feel like. And the tragedy is not the withdrawal itself. The tragedy is when a person who is capable of tremendous depth and connection convinces themselves that the withdrawal is who they are, rather than a response to conditions that were never quite right for who they are. You are not the person who cannot leave the house. You are a person who has learned through experience that the world outside your door has a high cost and a low guarantee of the kind of connection that actually matters to you. And that learning is not wrong. It is accurate. The outside world is expensive for people like you. But here's what I also know. The right door, opened at the right time, in the right conditions, with the right person on the other side, does not feel expensive at all. It feels like the return of something you forgot you had been missing, like the relief of being met. And that possibility does not expire. No matter how long the door has been closed, whatever brought you inside, and however long you have been there, the version of you that steps back into the world when the conditions are right is not a different person than the one who has been living quietly inward all this time. It is exactly the same person. Finally in the right room. Thank you so much for being here today. Leave me a comment and tell me which part of this landed for you. Because if you have been living your richest life on the inside, I want you to know I see that. And I think the world, the right parts of it, would be better for having you in it.